people come to Gettysburg, they tend to think that the battle is isolated around the borough. If you've watched enough videos from our channel relating to Gettysburg, you know that's not the case. And we enjoy exploring downtown Gettysburg and the fighting that occurred in town. And if you come right to the square, there is actually a regimental monument. This is the Company K of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, and they were the only unit from Gettysburg to fight in this action. What I mean is, Company K is made of Gettysburg residents, more essentially Adams County residents, and would have mustered into service right here in Gettysburg in June of 1861. This monument was erected by the Adams County Company K Memorial Committee in 1991 in honor of the 2,000 Adams Countyans who participated in the Civil War. And this gives you a breakdown of the command structure. They were attached to the 5th Corps of the Army of the Potomac. If you've ever watched the movie Gettysburg, you might recognize the 5th Corps. That is the unit that Joshua Chamberlain's 20th Maine were attached to. Well, Company K also was. In fact, there's a write-up over here. During the fighting on July 2nd, Company K in the center of the 1st Reserves helped to repulse the Confederate assault on Little Round Top. And over here is a whole roster of the men from Adams County that defended their home. And they quite literally defended their hometown in this action. I am standing on the platform of the Gettysburg Railway Station, which is just north of the town square. That is the Carlisle Street Pike Road, which you see the cars going across the tracks back there. And this was built just a few years prior to the Battle of Gettysburg. And this will serve as a very prominent landmark, not just for the battle, but for what's going to happen here in November of 1863. Now, Gettysburg have been trying to get a railroad out here since the 1830s, and you'll find out about a lot of towns in rural Pennsylvania across the whole Commonwealth. They're all trying to get their own short lines chartered once the first locomotives come to America. But costs a lot of money, and it requires a lot of manpower to build even just a few miles of line. So it wasn't until the late 1850s that the Gettysburg Railway actually got its first 17 miles laid. 17 miles to our east, this direction, is Hanover Junction, where trains that are coming all the way, coming from Washington, D.C., coming from Philadelphia, coming from Harrisburg, can hitch a ride to Gettysburg. And then it terminated here in the borough. Now that caused some conundrums, because if you have a steam locomotive going this way and there's no track any further, well, they had a intricate system of tracks over here where the shelter is today, back over here, where they would have to maneuver the locomotive to detach from the consist, put another locomotive on the eastern head to take it back. So it was a complex affair, but they made it work. They made it work, switching the locomotives out and getting the consist ready to go back to Hanover Junction. Now, we are in Gettysburg. There was a little battle here, just a little battle. I mean, we've made like, what, half a dozen videos on it here on the channel. Let's talk a little bit more about that. This station served as one of the major field hospitals for the battle. In fact, when John Buford, the Union cavalry officer, arrives in town on June 30th, he designates this as one of his field hospitals. And when the battle begins on July 1st, first it's going to start on the west, you might hear about a thing called the railroad cut. Now, there was no tracks west of town in 1863, but they were trying to clear a right-of-way. They had hopes that this can continue all the way to Chambersburg, and indeed, the railroad cut for the Gettysburg Railway became an integral landmark for the Union and Confederate forces fighting west of town. The fighting then's eventually going to swing to the north, and when the old corps of Stonewall Jackson, now commanded by Richard Ewell, is making their way down from Carlisle, they're going to start rushing soldiers of the 11th Union Corps out to meet them. And this story might sound familiar. We've talked about before. If you remember, a few years back, we went and visited what was known as the Brickyard. It was a You have to remember, this is heavily built up compared to what it was in 1863, but out in this brickyard that was in these open fields at the time, a brigade of Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers commanded by Charles Coster would fight out in that field. Now, he's going to send his Free New York regiments out into the brickyard to try to stop the collapse of the 11th Corps, but he's going to leave the 73rd Pennsylvania initially stationed right here. He's going to leave one of his regiments stationed right here to guard this hospital. Well, Confederate forces overwhelmed Union forces north of town. Forces west of town pull back through the streets. Street-to-street fighting is going to ensue. And you can imagine what these surgeons must have thought looking outside the windows, and they just see blue coats running for their lives in front of the windows, and then being chased by thousands of Confederates in gray and butternut. This would remain as a hospital during the Confederate occupation. It would allow the Union surgeons to go about their business. And even after this area was evacuated, this remained a hospital for several weeks after the battle. Now, eventually the hospitals, those that were too gravely wounded to be removed to hospitals in DC and Baltimore, they're going to be relocated a few miles to our east. It's now sadly a big business plaza, but that is where Camp Letterman, the largest field hospital of the American Civil War, was established. And this will still be an important part of Camp Letterman, as all the supplies, medical supplies needed for Camp Letterman are being offloaded here at the train station. Now, this train station is more famous not because it was involved in the Battle of Gettysburg, but of who visited here. On November 18th, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg on the eve of the dedication of the Soldiers National Cemetery. He took a train from Hanover Junction. That's where he transferred trains from DC. Transferred at Hanover Junction, took the 17-mile ride out here. There are some legends that he was writing the Gettysburg Address as he was traveling here. There's also people that say that he was writing the Gettysburg Address when he boarded at the David Wills house up street. Legends, a lot of legends. Who knows if they're true or not true? But he's going to arrive here on the evening of November 18th, 1863 to much fanfare. As I mentioned, he boards just a few houses up street in the house of David Wills, who was a noted lawyer in the area and instrumental in getting the National Cemetery kick-started. And then on November 19th, he is going to go south out of town to the cemetery and deliver the Gettysburg Address. He'll reboard the train here and head back to DC. So this station witnessed President Lincoln's arrival and departure when he delivered his most famous speech, arguably the most famous speech in 19th century America. Now, the station remained in operation. As I mentioned, the telegraph finally got installed here in 1866. Then in 1886, there is a one-story addition back here. This was installed to improve the waiting space. And by that point, they had finally gone the tracks west out of town, so the railroad continued several miles west. This was part of the Western Maryland Railway in the early 20th century. For a number of years, it was a little bit of limbo. Technically, the borough owned the station. I remember at one point there was actually a railroad museum inside here. But today, the Gettysburg Foundation owns and operates this property, and they have Ticket to the Past, which is a virtual reality experience where you can explore choice personalities that lived in Gettysburg during the time of the battle. And there's also a whole big controversy over the paint job. You'll see depictions of this in this white. You'll also see depictions of it in a yellow. To my knowledge, the white is the period correct paint job for the building. So yeah, Gettysburg Railway Station, the original railway station, as there's a second station on the other side. So here's the famous Farnsworth House. Originally was the Sweeney House, but right across the street, something I've never seen before, and this is the W.M. Holman House. Look here, they have a nice little placard. I actually think it's done by the property owner, not the borough themselves. They were called the Wharf Rats from New Orleans, but in the fight were considered some of the best in Lee's army. They were called the Louisiana Tigers. And this was the unit that held the southern portion of town on July 1st through July 3rd, 1863. Skirmishers and sharpshooters from Brigadier General Harry Hayes' Louisiana Tigers occupied most of the dwellings along Baltimore Street. That's that noisy street down there. They were, as early as the afternoon of July 1st, companies of the 17th Connecticut Volunteers took a position behind a broad fence at the base of the hill, where Locust Avenue is today. They were soon relieved by companies of the 73rd Pennsylvania Volunteer. This Union regiment, along with skirmishers from other Union outfits, engaged at close quarters with Hayes Tigers until almost 8:30 on July 2nd. Tigers at the windows of the William Homan House facing east and south were engaged in this fight. During this action, at least 45 Tigers were killed or wounded, and at least a number from the more exposed Union positions. General Hayes formed the battle line on High Street to attack Cemetery Hill on the evening of July 2nd. Louisianans advanced their right flank on Baltimore Street. Union fire from the base of this hill at the fence was poor due to the visibility of the hour and from the smoke of Confederate volleys. The rebels, with bayonet and club musket, drove the Federals away. The Rebs carried and occupied 6 Union guns on Cemetery Hill, but unsupported were forced to relinquish their gains. The Homan House remained in hands of the Confederates through July 4th before Lee evacuated the town. So, in short, these windows, there were elements of the Louisiana Tigers used in the house for shelter and firing kind of around the Sweetie House, firing up towards Cemetery Hill. Keep in mind, a lot of this, I say it over and over, but a lot of what you're seeing is built up and would have been a lot more spacious in 1863. A little easier to maneuver troops. Granted, you're going down one hill and ascending another, and no hotel to protect you. This brownstone townhouse, originally built in 1786 on a lot once owned by the Getty family, is most famous for being owned by Nicholas Cadore. Cadore was a French immigrant who came to Gettysburg in the 1840s to establish a butcher business, and he owned a farm south of town, which would become quite infamous as it sat between the Union and Confederate battle lines on July 2nd and 3rd, 1863. So this is one of the more storied homes in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Storied not so much because it's tied to the battle, but because this structure predates the battle by almost 100 years. In fact, this is as old as the United States of America. The Reverend Alexander Dobbin, who was from Northern Ireland, moved here in the mid-18th century and established this stone Georgian house in 1776. Several families lived through here. Of course, the Dobbin families who started with it, but during the time of the American Civil War, the Ziegler family actually lived here. Now, the husband, the Ziegler family, he was off fighting. His wife and children, however, had to take shelter during the battle. And if you are familiar with the Dobbin house is, you know you're in between the battle lines. Not familiar? This is Cemetery Hill. That's the Union battle line. The Confederates are several hundred yards down that way, and on July 2nd, the Confederate forces would try to make an assault on Cemetery Hill. So we are in no man's land. This is the night of July 2nd, 1863. Now, the Dobbin complex did not just have a house. Roughly in this vicinity, there would have also been a barn. And actually, Union forces coming from Cemetery Hill came down and actually had to chase Confederate sharpshooters out of the barn, as it had a good range of the Union line. Since then, it has become a restaurant, and also they have a gift shop attached to it. And upstairs, at least the last time I was in there, it's been many years since I was last in there, the second floor was like a small free museum about life in the Dobbin house. So yeah, this house in 2 years' time will be 250 years old, in time for our bicentennial. The restaurant itself also provides some history of this placard. It says that the Reverend Dobbin actually had a classical school, which was the first of its kind ever to be built west of the Susquehanna River. And it is also believed that this house was a stop on the Underground Railroad. We're less than a dozen miles from the Mason-Dixon line to Maryland, which was a slave state up to the American Civil War. So, and there are recorded histories of multiple Underground Railroad stops in Gettysburg and the surrounding countryside of Adams County. I appreciate you for tuning in to this edition of Retracing History. If you enjoyed what you saw on screen, be sure to hit the like button down below. And if you want to be notified when new videos such as this come up, be sure to subscribe to Readout Productions. If you want to go the extra mile in supporting this channel, you can go to my Ko-fi page with the link in the description below. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.